9 disgusting things Henry VIII did to his own children. The enemies who left the deepest scars on 3 of the most powerful monarchs in English history were not rival kingdoms, but their own biological father. Imagine a proud princess suddenly forced to bow down and serve as a maid to her own infant sister, or young souls pushed to the brink, forced to take up a pen and renounce the sacred lineage of their mother, just to buy a temporary, fragile peace. Why would a king, willing to overturn all of Europe to secure his heirs, turn their childhoods into such a suffocating space of psychological manipulation? This journey to decode 9 hidden psychological corners will reveal the greatest irony of royal power. You will understand a completely different lens on history. And sometimes, the most brilliant monarchs are forged not from love, but from the unfillable void of familial affection. Number 1. Demoting the 17-year-old eldest daughter to a maid for her infant sister, suffocating. December 1533, the marriage of Queen Catherine of Aragon was officially erased. To King Henry VIII, it was merely an administrative procedure to pave the way for his new calculations. But for Mary, his 17-year-old daughter, it was a direct blow that shattered her entire worldview and her legitimate right to exist within the dynasty. Mary carried the pride of Spanish blood, raised for 17 exhaustive years in the position of the heir apparent. Yet overnight, her father's rejection stripped away all her titles, turning her into a redundancy. Worse than an order of exile, and Henry VIII chose to crush her spirit through a nakedly cruel arrangement, transferring Mary to the Hatfield estate, forcing her into the role of a servant to wait upon her newborn half-sister, Elizabeth. Put yourself in the shoes of a 17-year-old girl to truly grasp the suffocation of this punishment. Someone who was once the center of all reverent gazes must now bow her head and serve, silently pacing beside the cradle of the one who had just inherited everything that once belonged to her and her mother. The corridors at Hatfield had no chains, but they imprisoned Mary in the scrutinizing, pitying eyes and the coldness of the retinue. Henry's decision left no visible wounds on her flesh, but it was precisely calculated to grind her self-esteem into dust. This is the ultimate psychological manipulation of a man standing at the pinnacle of power. Henry VIII understood well that to break his daughter's will to resist and to extinguish the hopes of the opposition, he did not need threats. He forced Mary to live in an irredeemably oppressive reality, making her witness another life, completely usurping the privileges and protection that were once hers every single day, was his way of forcing Mary to realize. Before the throne, she was now nothing more than an obedient tool. Mary's silent resignation during the sleepless nights guarding the silk cradle is the clearest evidence of an ego entirely broken. However, trampling on his eldest daughter's dignity was merely the opening move in a much darker chess game. But no one expected that a cold-blooded verdict was being quietly drafted right at the heart of the dynasty. And the next victim to enter that vortex of deprivation was the very mother of the child lying peacefully in that cradle. Number 2. Stealing the mother when Elizabeth was not yet 3 in 1536. History hails Elizabeth I as a great queen, the one who used an iron fist to mold the glorious golden age of England. But the naked truth that few dare to face is this. The first survival lesson of that monarch began with her biological father robbing her of her mother's warmth. In May 1536, the Tower of London witnessed a chillingly decisive and cold verdict. Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom Henry VIII had defied everything, overturning the entire European religious order to crown as queen, was now merely an obstacle needing clearance. The distance from ultimate favor to a fatal sentence lasted a mere 3 years, counting from the moment she gave birth to Elizabeth. There was no leniency from the man she once shared a bed with. With a sharp administrative decision, Henry ordered the end of Anne's life, completely erasing her presence from the royal court. But the most brutal consequence of this decision did not lie in the downfall of a queen. It struck directly into the psyche of a life not yet 3 years old. Elizabeth was thrust into orphanhood before she could form any distinct memories of the woman who bore her. The child had not yet memorized her face, nor grown accustomed to her mother's scent or voice. With a single powerful signature, Henry carved a permanent void into his daughter's subconscious, stripping away her only protector amidst a dynasty lurking with deceitful schemes. This deprivation was cruel in that Elizabeth did not just lose her mother, she lost the very chance to remember her. Her first home was torn apart, throwing the child into helplessness within the 4 walls of the palace, where family ties were now proven to be fragile and worthless before the throne. The way Henry VIII ended Anne Boleyn's life was incredibly swift and unfeeling. That permanent separation was like a decisive cut to sweep away a past no longer useful. Yet, if he used swiftness to determine Anne's fate with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, this king chose an entirely different method of manipulation, a slow, punishing tactic that eroded the spirit and meticulously severed the mother-daughter bond right up to the final moments. Number 3. The heartless ban, forbidding a daughter from seeing her mother. One last time in 1536. Revoking a legal title or demoting a 17-year-old girl to a servant apparently was not enough to satisfy the throne's absolute control. To completely demolish the will of those considered remnants of the old regime, Henry VIII decided to launch a ruthless attack on the most core vulnerability in human nature, a mother's love. It was early 1536. At Kimbolton Castle, a damp, dark space completely isolated from the outside world, Queen Catherine of Aragon was walking the final steps of her life. Her physical state was deteriorating day by day from severe illness. But the true torment the throne reserved for this woman did not lie in physical erosion or the coldness of stone walls. It lay in a silent decree of prohibition, spun to suffocate any last hope of reunion. The cruelty, laced with political calculation, was profound. When Catherine fell into her most fragile state, the boundary between life and death measured only in days, the court granted the Spanish ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, special permission to visit. A foreign man, bearing diplomatic status, was allowed to approach the deathbed. Meanwhile, Mary, her only flesh and blood, the daughter desperately clinging to the last shreds of family affection, who hit an ice-cold wall of rejection from her own father. Peel back the psychological layers of Mary during those desperate days to clearly see the suffocation of power. No physical punishment was applied, but the mental suppression occurred every minute of every day. The feeling of knowing full well that your mother is slowly taking her last breaths in a place just a few stages away. Yet your feet are bound by an invisible ban. Mary had humbled herself, had sent letters with the most earnest pleas just to beg for a tiny mercy, to see her mother's face one last time. But all she received was silence, a deliberate, razor-sharp silence. The distance now was no longer measured by geography. It was a display of absolute power. To Henry VIII did not need to build a prison of iron bars to lock up his daughter. He used his dictatorial authority to create a prison of the mind. He wanted Mary to engrave it into her bones. The throne has the power to bestow everything, and also the power to strip away the most basic human rights. Mary could only helplessly watch the permanent separation unfold in the panic of her imagination, trapped in the choking grief of a child, unable to fulfill her filial piety. And then, the inevitable happened. Catherine closed her eyes in the silent solitude of Kimbolton Castle, carrying the burning desire to touch her daughter's face into the afterlife. Mary permanently lost the chance to step to her bedside. She could not hold her mother's frail hand, could not hear a dying wish, nor utter a final goodbye herself. Preventative decision went far beyond a standard political maneuver. It was the ultimate deprivation of the right to be human, the right to fulfill one's emotional duty in the moment of life and death. It carved an unhealing wound into Mary's subconscious. Number 4. Neglecting Elizabeth to the point of having no clothes to wear from 1536 to 1542. The most brutal punishment of a monarch sometimes does not lie in the cold, wet walls of a dungeon or in sentences of exile. It is far more vicious and silent. It is absolute oblivion, the erasure of the very existence of one's own flesh and blood, while that child is still breathing. In July 1536, right as the shadow of Anne Boleyn was permanently wiped from the dynasty, a chilling decree was issued. On Elizabeth, a child who had not even celebrated her 3rd birthday, was officially stripped of the title of princess. From the position of a proud heir, the little girl was violently shoved out of the royal lineage, bearing the label of an illegitimate outcast. But Henry VIII did not just revoke her status on paper. Alongside that decree, he delivered a more horrifying blow: utter estrangement. For the next 6 agonizing years, the powerful king reigning at Whitehall barely set foot to visit his daughter. Not a single glance, not a line of inquiry, not a shred of royal favor was given to the daughter growing up in the shadows. Henry behaved entirely as if Elizabeth had never existed on this earth. Look at the contrast to clearly see the depths of this cruelty. While the king was drowning in lavish all-night banquets, pouring mountains of gold and silver into garments woven from gold threads and velvet studded with sparkling pearls, in a distant corner of the kingdom, his own flesh and blood was facing a heartbreaking reality. Elizabeth was not locked in a dark cell, but she was trapped in crippling material deprivation. This dark curtain was only truly ripped away by undeniable historical evidence. The desperate plea for help from her governess, Lady Bryan, sent to Thomas Cromwell, the king's powerful right hand. When a noblewoman must bite her tongue to write begging the ruling authorities, the limits of endurance have hit rock bottom. Every line of Lady Bryan's letter carried ultimate helplessness, exposing a cruel void beneath the magnificent facade of the Tudor era. Seat. The lady cautiously but painfully reported a naked truth. The royal child had grown fast, but the palace had not sent down a single penny for new clothes. Elizabeth's garments were old, frayed, and so tight they could not fit the developing body of a child. She had no decent clothes to go outside, no warm coats for the notoriously freezing English winters. Even more bitterly, the letter revealed that the child was so deprived, she lacked even the most basic undergarments to cover her body. Pause for a beat to absorb this reality. A little girl carrying royal blood, the biological daughter of a king possessing some of the vastest wealth in Europe, was left shivering in leftover rags, unable to keep her warm. The child had to expose the creases of her wrists because the sleeves number 5, forcing Mary to sign a document renouncing her origins in 1536. The summer of 1536 cast a suffocating aura over Mary's fate. The demise of Anne Boleyn seemed to offer a glimmer of light for her status to be restored. But no, it was merely the opening moment for the most venomous game of psychological manipulation Henry VIII had ever orchestrated. To receive basic provisions and hold on to her fragile breath in a court rife with purges, Mary was backed into a dark corner with no way out. This time, the throne did not need to use orders of imprisonment. They utilized an instrument with far more devastating destructive power than any whip: a piece of paper and a pen. Under her father's cold direction, Thomas Cromwell presented Mary with a document already drafted, word by word, and the demand was not just a hasty signature. Mary was forced to personally transcribe the entire indictment that crushed her own dignity. Every stroke of black ink pressed onto the page was a deep gash into her subconscious. She had to write the words acknowledging her father as the supreme head of the church, publicly turning her back on the faith she deeply revered. But the climax of the degradation lay in the final lines. That document forced Mary to write down a self-denial, acknowledging that the marriage of her late mother, Queen Catherine, was illegitimate, and that she herself, a proud princess of royal blood, was merely a bastard. An illegal existence, a bastard child unworthy of respect. Try to feel the extreme trembling of the hands tightly gripping that pen. Surrounding Mary at that moment was a chillingly silent void. There was absolutely no one to lean on. If she refused, she knew full well she would face the heaviest charge of treason, signifying a permanent end to her life. Amidst the darkness of threats and the fiercely rising instinct to survive, Mary closed her eyes and signed. With her own handwriting, she tore apart her identity, denying the sacred roots of her mother to trade for a haunting, fragile peace. If you find yourself shuddering at how absolute power can force a person to strip away all dignity just to stay alive, linger for a second to hit like and subscribe. Your companionship is the driving force for us to continue peeling back the darkest layers of royal power, where the limits of human endurance were constantly tested. Oh, Mary had to grit her teeth and use ink to carve out her own rejection. However, Henry VIII's tragedy of manipulation took many forms. For his little daughter Elizabeth, the court did not offer a piece of paper forcing her to sign. Instead, they cast an invisible yet equally suffocating command, forcing that child to personally bury all memories of the one who gave her life. Number 6. Erasing memories. The ban on Elizabeth, mentioning her mother's name. The cruelest suffocation sometimes is not in cramming an extreme ideology into someone, but in coercing a person to manually wipe clean their own natural stream of memories. For Elizabeth, the vast royal palace was not just a place where she was abandoned to material coldness. It was a lightless, psychological isolation cell, where her mother's name was turned into a barometer measuring her very survival. Immediately after Anne Boleyn's presence was permanently closed out, Henry VIII launched a sweep so thorough it sends shivers down the spine, targeting every legacy of his former wife. The intertwined H and A symbols on the walls, reliefs, or window frames were mercilessly chiseled and scraped away. Portraits were taken down and hidden in the darkest corners. Anne Boleyn's name became an absolute taboo in every nook and cranny of the dynasty. While normal children start getting curious about their roots, about the person who brought them into the world, Elizabeth had to learn to swallow every question back down to the bottom of her throat. Surrounding the little girl was an atmosphere thick with paranoia. The wet nurses, the serving maids were all on edge in fear. Absolutely no one dared to utter a half word about the late queen. In her tender mind, molded by power, the image of her mother was framed as the shadow of a sinner, a figure for whom even sighing in remembrance could draw severe punishments. No shackles or direct threats aimed at the child were necessary. The complicit silence of the entire royal apparatus created the perfect blow of psychological manipulation. Elizabeth was forced to slam shut the door leading to her roots, burying her curiosity and yearning for a mother's love alive as soon as it flickered. The masterful ability to conceal emotions of a brilliant future queen, ironically, it was seeded from those long nights having to bite her lip to stop herself from crying for her mother. That absolute silence clung to Elizabeth like a gloomy shadow, persistently remaining until the day she officially stepped onto the pinnacle of England's power. Sweeping away the traces of time, stripping titles, and shattering all psychological foundations, Henry VIII completely remolded the existence of his two daughters. When the sacred shell of blood ties was peeled away, those lives carrying royal blood were quickly thrown onto a chessboard colder and vastly more calculating, the chessboard of soulless diplomatic exchanges. Number 7. Turning children into pawns for diplomatic bargaining. Even pushed out of the legitimate line of succession, even stripped of every proud title of a princess, Mary and Elizabeth still carried an inerasable asset: Tudor royal blood. And Henry VIII, a shrewd master player on the European political chessboard, absolutely never wasted any resource. When family ties had been drained dry, not leaving a single drop of warmth, the only thing connecting the throne and these two daughters was their exchange value in alliances. Look at Mary's growing years to clearly see the cruelty of these soulless treaties. From the time she was a child, not yet 10, an age where the world should solely encompass innocence and safety, her fate was tossed around without pity. Today, she is betrothed to the Dauphin of France to solidify a fragile concession. But just tomorrow, when the political winds shift and England needs a different crutch, that betrothal is instantly torn up, and Mary is peddled to the Holy Roman Emperor. The upheavals happened continuously, dizzyingly. Girls of royal blood were pushed onto international negotiating tables like high-end collateral, weighed and measured through territorial pacts and grueling commitments of support. Their psyches were constantly broken. They had to prepare mentally to become the mother of a foreign kingdom, only to immediately be cast down as redundant when talks collapsed. Having hope planted only to be brutally extinguished, their existence was reduced to cards dealt and withdrawn entirely depending on the calculations of the dealer. It was the ultimate deprivation of autonomy. Henry did not look at Mary and Elizabeth as children needing a safe harbor, and he established a perimeter of absolute control, where his children were not allowed to have personal feelings, not allowed to refuse, and certainly not allowed to be the masters of their own destiny. This manipulation was sophisticated because it cloaked itself in the dazzling cape of duty to the realm, but beneath it was an absolute draining of the most fundamental human right. The daughters were marginalized, treated as inanimate negotiating tools. So what about the center of the dynasty? You might think the only son, for whom Henry VIII turned England upside down, trading countless separations to obtain, must have enjoyed a life of freedom, overflowing with happiness? In stark contrast to neglect or exploitation, the life of Prince Edward was submerged in a tragedy of control on the opposite spectrum. And according to many credible historical records, while not quite an extreme medical isolation ward, the strict surveillance done in the name of his father's love created an invisible house arrest. A spectrum of psychological control so silent and suffocating It defies belief. Number 8. Imprisoning Edward under a sterile regime. Henry VIII craved a male heir so desperately he was willing to rip apart all connections, discard wives, and turn his biological daughters into worthless pawns. So when that flesh and blood, Prince Edward, officially cried his first cry, was it a fairy tale ending bathed in the halo of absolute freedom and love? The truth reveals an equally suffocating picture. Edward's fate was not drowned in oblivion like Elizabeth's, nor was his dignity tortured like Mary's. Instead, the boy's life was boxed into a tragedy of strangulation called overprotection. Many outdated historical lenses often assign Edward the image of a frail, sickly prince from the cradle. But modern research has exposed an entirely different reality. Edward was actually a healthy child, brimming with energy and an intense desire for physical activity. He loved riding horses, loved being active, and wanted to break out into the vast world beyond those cold stone walls. However, that instinctual longing was crushed by the massive psychological shadow of his own father. The ultimate fear of losing his most precious royal asset turned Henry VIII into an extreme, controlling father. He ordered the establishment of a sterile regime so stringent it was terrifying around his son's living space. The palace where Edward resided was no longer a home. It transformed into a strictly quarantined fortress. Anyone, whether high-ranking officials or nobles, who wished to enter the prince's line of sight had to pass through the most rigorous health and background checks. The boy's clothes, toys, even the smallest items had to be cleaned to the king's maddening standards to eliminate any invisible miasmas. Imagine the silent isolation of a child standing at the peak of the kingdom, yet unable to freely touch a flower in the garden without the scrutinizing gaze of the guards. Edward lacked neither a scrap of silk nor a lavish meal, but he was entirely isolated from the natural flow of life, and he was turned into an aristocratic prisoner right within the very kingdom that would belong to him. Henry VIII placed his son under house arrest in a gilded cage forged from fear, stripping him of the right to grow up as a normal human being, forcing Edward to live like a fragile porcelain artifact merely to satisfy the selfish reassurance of the throne. One stripped of dignity, one buried in neglect, one suffocated in a glass box. All three of Henry VIII's flesh and blood were molded and bent by his own hands using the most brutal psychological gaslighting tactics. But that powerful monarch probably never anticipated that the chess game he spent his whole life setting up would lead to the most ironic conclusion history had ever witnessed. Number 9. The unexpected reversal. On all three, trampled children become monarchs. This is the most bitter and silent mockery of power. Henry VIII spent a lifetime ruling to manipulate and crush his children's psyches, hoping to architect a flawless line of succession. Yet, the wheel of history turned in a much more naked way. The very lives he had shoved to the rock bottom of humiliation ultimately stepped onto the throne. But they did not rule with forgiveness. Beneath the royal cloaks, their thrones were the clearest lenses reflecting the deep psychological scars their father had carved into them. The young King Edward VI did not rule with empathy because he had never been allowed to live as a normal human. The coldness and rigidity in his policies were actually the aftermath of a childhood completely isolated in a sterile glass cage where all natural human connections were severed. The harshness of Queen Mary I was not born out of nowhere. It was the explosive recoil of a psyche backed into a corner for 2 decades. Her entire reign was a desperate, uncompromising rebellion to restore her late mother's honor. She ruled with the extreme stubbornness and paranoia of someone whose own father had stripped her of all dignity. And Elizabeth I, the architect of the glorious Golden Age. Her decision never to marry and her intense vigilance were not simply diplomatic strategies. It was the defense mechanism of someone with a survivor's mentality. She would rather hold power in lifelong solitude than hand over her vulnerability and self-control to anyone. A blood-soaked lesson absorbed from watching how her father discarded the women around him. Henry VIII created supreme power, but the price was the eradication of all human values. The most formidable monarchs of England did not reign using a legacy of love, but through the defensive instincts forged from the razor-sharp silence of a father, a man who placed the weight of the crown above all ties of blood. And perhaps that is the most thorny shape of power. To stand on the peak of solitude, sometimes one must manually strip away the humanity of the very lives they created. The journey to peel back the psychological corners of the Tudor dynasty closes here. Now, if this darkly tinted historical footage has held your attention until the final minute, please leave a like and subscribe. Your companionship is the fulcrum for us to continue opening other hidden doors of the past.